May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Fear is a part of life. Fear of losing, fear of being wrong, fear of failure, rejection, change, psychological phobias. 2 years ago, there was a heightened fear of COVID. Not so much now. Perhaps replacing it is the monkeypox outbreak. Climate change, evidenced by increasing floods, fires, tornadoes, things of that nature, could bring about fear to the point of us thinking, well, maybe we're in a season of plagues and God is trying to tell us something. Fear is rational and irrational, can mean the difference between life and death, as fear can be a catalyst toward faith. Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 6, which we heard read earlier, is a short read, but contains an important shift in the mindset of Abram. Now, God has previously promised Abram a great nation. At that time, he was 75 years of age, with no due date for a child. In fact, it would be 25 years later when Abram is 100 and Sarah is 90 that the child is born. So right now we're in the in-between time where the pericope invites us to hear this conversation. Here, Abram is afraid that the promise will not be fulfilled. He still has no biological heir, and from his household it appears Eleazar will inherit his property. But in the quiet of the night, God comes to Abram in a vision, speaking words of reassurance. That man will not be your heir will be from your own flesh and blood. In this mystical encounter with God, Abram is led outside into the night, and God says, look toward the heaven, count the stars if you are able to count them, so shall your descendants be. Look up into the sky. If you're able to count all the stars, that will be the number of your descendants. Now, as a result of this night vision, suddenly Abram believes God. Suddenly Abram believes. Abram has faith in God, believing that the giver of life, faith, and love is speaking truth to him. Truth spoken, whereas before he doubted. Suddenly he believes. Now Abram and Sarai will live with the current circumstances, though, of being childless with no apparent heir. Sarai well into menopause. Day in, day out, month in, month out, year in, year out, the promise being fulfilled still up in the air. No descendants like the number of stars in the sky. The dominant culture would have looked askance at this couple, written them off, considered them to be worthless, but they continue on in faith. Now, as the story goes forward, we're told that Sarai grew impatient and suggested that Abram have a child with her servant, Hagar the Egyptian. That happens. Ishmael is born. But that doesn't solve the situation, because God has made this promise to Abram and Sarai. Not Abram and somebody else. It's Abram and Sarai. Later on, God changes their name to Abraham and Sarah. And in due time, like I said, 25 years later, Isaac is born. Abraham had faith, but no evidence existed. The odds not in their favor. The author of the letter to the Hebrews writes, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And referring to Abraham, therefore, one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of heaven, and as innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. All of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. We are the descendants of Abraham and Sarah, far greater than they could have ever imagined. And this is all because Abraham counted on God's faithfulness. Faith fed by fear that could have led to paralysis, apathy, or hopelessness morphed into increased faith in God. It's important to note that Abram did not seek out this blessing from God. There was no prayer. In the context of Genesis, Abram just suddenly appears. And God says, you and your wife and your nephew Lot, you're going to go to a new land. So they pick up stakes and leave. Imagine the faith that takes, would take for you. All of a sudden, someone says, hey, you need to move to Mississippi. You need to move to Wyoming. You need to move to Canada. The someone being God. How would you discern if it was indeed God's voice? So we heard about that mystical experience that Abram has with God in the night, looking up at the stars. And I think today we somewhat long to have that same sort of experience with God. A yearning, perhaps at a spiritual depth that has no ending. We so want to know that God is real, that God is in our lives, that God can make a difference. We so want to believe that. The many circumstances we face personally, challenges in our country, things once a green light, suddenly a red light, like watching a tennis match. Things go back and forth, a lot of chaos. So where is God? How much time do you make in your life to be with God, to have a sacred space, as Abram did? Abram most likely would have missed this mystical moment with God if he had been out tending to cattle, if he'd been out talking to somebody, distracted. Of course, there wasn't a whole lot of distractions then. They had a certain simple lifestyle. At least we project that it must have been compared to ours. So it's a little bit more challenging for us today. But I think the call for this scripture from Genesis is to really think about ways in which your life is connected to the life of God, and how faith fits into your journey, how your prayer life may include prayers that you are waiting for an answer for, have been waiting for years, like Abraham and Sarah waited, and you may give up hope. But following their example, which was to move forward with faith. As we just sang, we've come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord. That's what Abraham and Sarah leave for us today. And we know they were not perfect, not at all. Abraham told some untruths. He was married to his half-sister, all sorts of things. That's why I love the book of Genesis. They're so rich with detail of what was going on in the lives of people. So we can ask ourselves, can we believe like Abraham and Sarah, imperfect, but still carrying a lamp of faith forward? Can you believe and trust in God's faithfulness without any evidence? Can you carry even a seed of faith within your soul? The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That's what it takes. That's why we're here today, because people who came before us, from generation to generation, carried a lamp seed filled with hope and faith that they would not realize themselves, but we have inherited it. And so we are charged to carry forward for the generation coming behind us, and so forth. Faith in God, even though we don't see the evidence, to have faith and trust that God is there, that God is always faithful to us, and we should try our best to be faithful in return. Amen.